think it was somewhat mean-spirited and not entirely true, actually. Just as an example. The man had a short attention span. He served as governor for 2 months before deciding he preferred the Senate. You said you read my book?
Yes,
okay.
I did.
In the book, I'm sure you may remember, it indicated he wanted to be reelected to the Senate.
Yes.
He didn't want to be governor of Maine at all. That was a loser as far as he was concerned. And consequently, he did run, and my feeling was that apparently the leaders of the Republican Party in Maine made a deal with him and said, if you got elected governor, we'll put you back in the Senate, which they did. So from the very beginning, he had his eye on another term in the Senate. And one of the funny things about Hamlin, what do you suppose is the only thing anybody ever knows about Hamlin? Certainly outside of Maine and even inside Maine.
Like his vice president.
He was vice president
yes.
under Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
See, Lincoln is kind of like a large tree who shades everything underneath it. Stephen Douglas is a good example of that, perhaps the best example, because Douglas is a very important politician, very famous, and now nobody knows anything about him except the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So Hamlin's only claim to fame is being vice president, and he knew better than anybody else what a miserable office this was. It had no power connected with it at all. Under the Constitution, I'm sure you know that there's only one thing that the vice president does: preside over the Senate, and most of them don't do that anymore either. But but that's the main thing he was remembered for, because he was a United States Senator for 25 years or 26 years, and member of the lower house. In other words, he had a long and rather brilliant political career, but nobody remembers that anymore. So that's true of all politicians, basically. So anyway, so I was not I didn't know anything about this. I'm a long time subscriber to Time magazine, but this was a special thing apparently. Something that they had done during the 2008 campaign, right? McCain and Obama. I thought it was kind of mean-spirited, not, as I said, not entirely true. So, but by the way, before I forget to give this to you, this is something that I ran off for you. It's from the Abraham Lincoln Encyclopedia. It's a brief biographical sketch of Hamlin, which may a little bit more user-friendly than the book. And also, in the third page is a thing on Cyrus Hamlin, picture, and a little biographical sketch of Cyrus Hamlin.
Oh, well, that's one.
If you can, hope you can read it, Aaron, because Elaine tried to put the book down as flat as she could, but it didn't get everything in place. So take those along with you. They may be helpful.
Thank you. So,
So what is Hamlin best known for? Being vice president, I guess. And what do you think? What do you think Hamlin should be best known for? Well, I suppose he would consider the fact that he was a very good representative of Maine interests and Maine people, and had a very good constituency service thing going. Also, the fact that he was a pretty strong voice to keep slavery out of the territories, just like Lincoln was. Their views on that were pretty much the same. Both of them recognized that slavery had a legitimate reason to exist, but they were very determined not to let it spread anywhere else. However, as you know from looking at the book, when the war came, Hamlin changed his views and came out very quickly in favor of abolition as a means of punishing the South, as a means of weakening the South. Lincoln was hesitant because he had other concerns, including the border states, the loyal slave states, which he was afraid might be driven into the Confederacy if he moved prematurely on the slavery thing. But eventually, of course, after the Battle of Antietam, he does issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and supposedly read that to Hamlin, although some historians doubt that that actually ever happened. It's a little,
Yeah.
how these things are. You were asking, by the way, about the Charles Eugene Hamlin biography of Hamlin. That's a very useful book, actually. It has a lot of stuff, particularly in his early life, that you can't find anywhere else. I used it quite extensively, particularly for the early life. But you have to realize this was written by his grandson, and it's very, very favorable to him. Always referring to as Mr.
If it was
Hamlin.
your grandfather, you want to make him look as
Yeah,
good as possible.
Exactly. Absolutely right.
Like what he wrote about having one hair crossed over the other.
Oh yeah, yeah. When he was a member of that legislative thing, yeah, that could be a true anecdote. But there's some good things in there. But one of the things I wanted to do in my book was to document where everything came from, and there's no documentation in Hamlin's book at all. You don't know where he got the stuff from. A lot of it was personal reminiscence, that kind of thing. But I wanted to have well, you can see what we historians call the scholarly apparatus. All these notes at the end, pages and pages of notes, indicating where the stuff came from. So I think you can use the Charles Eugene Hamlin biography. A lot of historians, even today, use it and cite it in their bibliographies. But as long as you realize, and I know you do, because you captured it perfectly, as long as you realize that he wants to make his grandfather look good.
Okay. So also, how should we cite you for this interview? Like, we weren't sure if we should do Mr. H. Draper Hunt or Doctor.
Doctor is fine, or
Okay.
professor, anything like that. Yeah, doctor's okay.
Okay.
This was my doctoral dissertation at Columbia.
Oh.
This book. That's what I wrote it for. So, yeah, Doctor H.
How long
Draper.
did it take you to write that book?
I started it when I was living in New York. My wife and I lived in New York, and I was teaching at Hunter College for 3 years. And I started it there, and I finished it when we came to Maine in 1965. While I was teaching full-time, it was a tough job because it's hard work to write a book when you're teaching full-time, but I was able to get through it. So it took me, I finished the book in 1968, went down to New York you have to go and defend the dissertation before a panel of professors, which is a little bit daunting. I went down in December of 67, actually, defended it and got the degree in 68. So, by the way, I wanted to give you, let's see if I have it here. Yeah, I wanted to give you this too. This is a brief vita
Oh, thank
telling
you.
a lot about myself
thank you.
and
Great.
all the stuff that my degrees and the publications and other things at the university. I was at USM from 65 to 97 when I retired. And, so
Thank you.
I've been
This
here a while. You're
is
very
gonna be
welcome.
helpful.
Yeah. It's a well-stuffed and interesting binder here.
Yeah. Okay.
So how do you present this for National History Day? Do you show the videotape or?
Yeah, you show the video,
Mm-hmm.
and then after you've shown the video,
Yeah.
The judges ask you. Actually, sorry, I got that wrong. The first thing you do is you give them like your process paper and your bibliography.
Mm-hmm.
So you give them those two things. They look them over for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Then you show their video.
Yeah.
And then after showing the video, they'll ask you some questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the questions are a pretty big part of it too.
I bet they are. Yeah.
Because I think last year made it to the National History Day down in D.C.
Oh, wow, great.
And it
Very impressive, yeah.
we saw this one video that I thought was really good,
Mm-hmm.
but the person didn't do very well on the questions.
Oh, the questions,
and we
okay,
didn't see
yeah.
him in the finals at all.
Oh,
and I
really?
thought he was the best video
Yeah,
out of the group we saw.
you've got to be able to have a good
Oh.
video and also defend it. And
It's
answer
pretty
questions.
tricky.
Yeah, I bet it is, yeah. That's great, so I hope you'll make it to the finals this year as an individual. That was part of the group last year that did the thing, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And everyone in the group this year is doing their own personal project, so they'll all be competing against
Oh,
each
I see,
other.
okay.
So it could be interesting.
They decided that the group approach was not the best one to
Well,
follow, yeah.
They all had their own unique strengths, and they didn't overlap necessarily. So there were lots of different opinions, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
It's hard to do a group project.
Oh, it is. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Forget. You think it will be easier, and it never ever is.
No.
That's what I found.
I
And you have a lot of egos that are involved in it, so that's another problem.
What happened with the questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this one other kid had this tendency to, when the judges were asking us questions, he did know some answers and he did answer them, but when he didn't know the answer, he would go,
Not a good approach.
yeah, and completely block out any other answer from me and the other kid.
Oh, I see. Oh,
That was both.
used up the time with an ah. Oh, too bad.
Yeah. So
So,
I won't have to deal with that this year
Right.
unless I'm doing it myself.
yeah.
So
So other questions?
yes. So we saw some of the Hamlin papers.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a really hard time reading the 1800s handwriting.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering how you managed that.
Now where did you see them? Did you go to Orono to the library up there?
Yes.
You went up to the Fogle Library. Okay, good, great. And you saw that each one of them was in a white folder. I did that at the Columbia University Library. They actually paid me to do that. And some of them, Hamlin's handwriting actually is pretty easy to read. Others are not so easy to read. So you just have to try to figure out, by context and that kind of thing.
I think we were looking at more correspondence to Hamlin.
To him, yeah, okay, yeah,
So.
yeah. And you found a number of James G. Blaine letters up there too, I imagine, yeah. I think Blaine is a good example of how people forget the famous politicians of the past, because he was a big league guy. He was probably the most important Republican politician of the 19th century, at that time in the 19th century. And yet today, nobody remembers him at all, not much more than Hamlin. Although he ran for president and almost got elected in 1884. But I was able to get my way through it by guess and by guessing, I guess.
Yeah. I had to just look him up to figure out who he was when I first saw his name.
Oh, Blaine?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you've
I'd
made my
never heard
point
of him
for me.
before.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there
Yeah.
you go. And you're a well-informed young man, so if you didn't know who Blaine was, he was, as a matter of fact, he was walking through the railroad station with James A. Garfield when Garfield was shot
Oh, wow.
in 1881. Yeah, he was Secretary of State under Garfield.
That's interesting.
And but he was also a very powerful and very controversial politician. A lot of people thought he was a crook, frankly. So, without necessarily good reason to think that, but that was what his enemies said.
I looked up a couple of other politicians, and there was this one funny story in here. If I can find it. I have it somewhere.
Thomas Brackett Reed, by any chance? Thomas Brackett Reed, was he one of the ones you?
Possibly.
He was
I'm
a
not-
he was a
Yeah,
very
I did.
famous Speaker of the House, actually, Federal House of Representatives.
There it is.
I'd say you've done a lot of work on this. Aaron, good for you.
There it is. Thomas Brackett Reed.
Yeah, Thomas Brackett Reed. There you go. How about that? Huh? He was a congressman from Maine, a longtime congressman, and an extremely powerful Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. And somewhat controversial because he was kind of heavy-handed in the way he ran the House. Blaine also was a very powerful Speaker of the House of Representatives, too.
Yeah.
First in Maine and then in Washington. So
Thomas Brackett Reed. They called him Tsar Reed.
Tsar Reed, that's right, because he ran the House with an absolute iron hand. But he had a very good sense of humor too.
Yeah. So, he was. People were refusing to answer for roll call.
Right.
Who were even hiding under their desks.
That's right, yeah.
And one broke down a door to get out. And then he marked them all as present
As
anyway.
And they objected. And he said, "You say that you're not present. You're not. Here you are." So he was able to defeat that obstructionist movement.
Kind of difficult to say you're not there.
Right. If you're saying you are there
That's
by
right.
protesting the fact that you're not there.
That's right.
So.
What else you got, hon?
Okay. is there anything you noticed later that you would like to change about your book?
The only thing that I should have included in it, I wanted to get it done and get the degree, frankly. The only thing that I would have added to it, and I regretted I didn't do it, was Hamlin and his wife took a trip out west when he was the senator from Maine. And I should have included something about that because it was kind of interesting. They went out to the Wild West on a visit out there. But aside from that, I think it's pretty much, I think I would stand pretty much by what I wrote there.
This would be a good follow-up question and ask what was interesting about the visit out west, why it was interesting.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. I didn't really do the research.
Okay.
I didn't really read the letters and diaries
Yeah.
and things which I should have done to put it in there. But I wanted to, and my thesis advisor, Eric McKittrick, who was a famous Reconstruction history scholar at Columbia, wanted me to finish up, so I moved a little more quickly than I should have over that thing. But that's neither here nor there, really, I suppose, no.
Okay, so what was Hannibal Hamlin best known for, like, during his lifetime in the 1800s?
I'd say he was probably certainly well known for patronage. In those days, there was no civil service, and you had to have a senator or a congressman who could round up jobs for people back home, and Hamlin was very good at this. And one of the reasons that he was so frustrated as vice president, he had no influence anymore in that way. As a senator, he had a lot of influence. He could round up jobs for Maine people. As vice president, he couldn't do that. And yet, one of the things that Time magazine article indicated was that he was sort of a do-nothing vice president, not by choice. The only way a vice president has any power at all is if the president gives it to him. And Lincoln sort of ignored it. Lincoln had I'm sure he felt much more important things to concern him. And there was a tradition also, and again, this is a corrective on that Time magazine thing. He went back to Maine. He spent a lot of time in Maine as vice president because traditionally, as soon as Congress convened and the vice president opened the Senate proceedings, they elected a president pro tempore, one of the senators who would preside. And traditionally, the vice president went home and was only there periodically. And the Congress didn't meet that long anyway in those days. They only met for a few months at a time. So he had to have something to do, so he went back home. He farmed his acres in Bangor, and in 1864, he served in the Maine Coast Guards, which was a militia unit, as company cook, which is kind of a colorful thing. As I indicate in the book, nothing illustrates so graphically the insignificance of this office than the fact that its incumbent could play at being a soldier for several months in 1864 when a lot was going on in the war. He would like to have had more influence, but it was very difficult given the office he held, because the vice presidency is a pretty sorry office. At least it was then. It's become more important now. I mean, look at Cheney, for example. Cheney was a very powerful vice president. And I think Mondale to some extent too. And certainly Joe Biden now. But back in Hamlin's day, the president didn't give way to him, and that was it. And the only way he would have been able to escape from that role would be if the president was killed. And if he had been renominated, they would have been reelected, and he would have become president instead of Andrew Johnson. And that's the great what if of Hamlin's life. He would have been a much better president than Andrew Johnson. Much more politically savvy than Johnson. Much more flexible, much more understanding of what the Northern public mind felt about the ex-Confederates. How concerned they were that the South was trying to somehow reinstitute a form of slavery, even though they couldn't do this. There was a great concern about that, and Andrew Johnson was considered to be really kind of pro-Southern. He was from Tennessee, after all. But one of the big questions in the book is what role did Lincoln play in replacing Hamlin with Johnson? Some historians believe that what Lincoln said, that he didn't play any role at all, let the convention choose the vice president. I don't agree with that. I think that I know that Lincoln was very much concerned about his reelection at the time that the nominating convention met in June of '64, and to choose a vice president with some political clout was important to him. And Andrew Johnson was a Democrat who had fought, who had stayed with the Union and very courageously remained as a pro-Union man. And it would help to gather Democratic votes for Lincoln if he put Johnson on the ticket. Also, it would show to foreign countries that the United States was not as badly off as they might think if they could nominate somebody who was a Southerner for vice president. So that's my interpretation of it.
Okay, so what do you think Hannibal Hamlin was best known for in the 1900s?
In the 1900s, you mean the next century?
Yeah, like, they had a 100-year celebration, sort of.
Yeah.
For his birthday.
Oh yes. Well, they just had a 200th anniversary, and in fact, I spoke at Orin
Oh, cool.
on Hannibal Hamlin.
Is that what?
No, that's not, we don't have that.
2000, and it was in 2010, the year after. One thing you may have noticed, Aaron, is that that Lincoln and Hamlin were born the same year, 1809. And in the book, at my mentor's suggestion, I sort of compared their childhoods and their backgrounds a little bit to make it a little more interesting. So, but again, people would not know much about Hamlin except for his vice presidency, which was as far as he was concerned, the most frustrating part of his life, ironically.
And then, what is Hannibal Hamlin best known for now, and why has it changed?
He's not well known. He's not any better known now than he was before, really. Perhaps less well known. Again, it's because of the vice presidency, particularly the Civil War and the Lincoln connection is important in that. Even though Lincoln and Hamlin were certainly not very close, otherwise Lincoln would have probably found something more useful for him to do than letting him go up and be a non-com in the Maine Coast Guard. So I think that's about it. On the other hand, he, like Lincoln, was a strong voice in favor, first of all, of preventing the spread of slavery, second of all, of emancipating the slaves, and also, as you know, through Cyrus Hamlin, the use of Negro troops. There were about 150,000 black troops in the Civil War, and Hamlin was one of the voices in favor of doing that. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was a draft in the North during the Civil War because soldiers were not coming forward and volunteering. So they apportioned a certain number of troops to each state, and they had to fill these quotas. So some of the states, particularly Governor John Andrew in Massachusetts and others, thought it would be a dandy idea to go down south and recruit free Negroes and enlist them as part of their quota. And that was one of the things behind it. But Cyrus Hamlin commanded black troops and entered the war as a major general by brevet. A brevet is sort of a temporary and honorary promotion. But he was a brigadier general, and then made a major general.
Right?
Yeah, Ullman's Brigade. Daniel Ullman, that's right. I talk about him in the book too. Died of yellow fever in New Orleans in the early 70s, I think. But his older brother, Charles, was also a brigadier general. So being sons of Hannibal Hamlin meant fairly high rank. And why not?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are your thoughts about Hannibal Hamlin's integration of the Union Army and his thoughts on slavery and the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln-Hamlin connection?
Well, Hamlin believed that slavery was an evil. And he believed that when he was in the Maine legislature in the 1830s and 40s.
Moral and social evil, right?
Moral and social evil, exactly right. Yeah, you have the quote. Exactly, it's in the book there. And he was opposed to the Compromise of 1850 as a comprehensive package because it made people, as he said, vote for things they didn't want to get what they did want. And he was in favor of free California, and he was in favor of the ending of the slave trade, but not in favor of popular sovereignty in the territories in New Mexico and Utah. And then in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which allowed the Missouri Compromise to be
bypassed.
They repealed it. They repealed the Missouri Compromise. He was very much against that. He was instrumental in getting Maine to support that opposition view. And he, in 1856, he broke with the Democratic Party to become a Republican because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and because the Democratic Party was still supporting that. He had been chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, which is a very important chairmanship. And the book tells, there again, the Time magazine writer made it sound as if he did nothing. He did a lot. He was very instrumental in regulation of commerce and establishing Bangor as a port of entry, all kinds of commercial things. You can read about it in the book. But then he became a Republican in June of 1856 and immediately was drafted to run for governor. The governorship was a one-year term, part-time job. The governor didn't even live in Augusta in those days, with a salary probably 1/5 of what a U.S. senator made at that time. And Hamlin didn't want that. He didn't want to give up his Senate seat, but he did, because he realized if he didn't do that, the Republicans would probably not elect him to another term in the Senate. He had to pay the price, in effect, which he did, cheerfully. And he won by 26,000 votes, which is a huge amount. And he gave 99 speeches during the campaign. Now, if you can picture Maine as it was at that time, the transportation system of Maine, there were railroads here, but there was an awful lot of boondock places that he spoke in that were very hard to get to. So he made a very vigorous campaign and won a huge victory. It became something of a celebrity nationally as a result of that. And after a month in office, the legislature elected him for another term in the Senate. And there he stayed until 1861. And then after the Civil War, he was appointed collector of the Port of Boston by Andrew Johnson. Lincoln had originally intended that to happen. Andrew Johnson appointed him collector, which was a very big patronage plum. Pretty good salary connected with it and so forth. But he broke with Andrew Johnson over Reconstruction policy and resigned rather publicly. And in 1869, he was reelected to the Senate, defeating Lot Morrill, who was the incumbent senator, and served for 12 more years. And toward the end of into his second term, he was elected chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which was probably the most important Senate committee of all. And that's all in the book too. You can read about that. So he had a fairly long, certainly a very long and a fairly influential career within the Senate establishment itself. And yet, here we are, wondering what happened to Hamlin, or wondering what happened to James G. Blaine, who was a presidential nominee in 1884. And had the state of New York not voted for Grover Cleveland, he would have been elected president. Maine would have had his first president. As it is, Maine only has one vice president, and that's Hamlin. So, any further?
Yeah. So, why do you think Hannibal Hamlin isn't very well known, and when he is known, not in a very nice way, like with the Time magazine?
Well, I think the not in a very nice way is a bit of an exaggeration. I think most, unless you had read that Time magazine thing, you would not question the fact that Hamlin was a pretty good politician and a very honest politician. But again, politicians' political careers are quickly forgotten in this country, with very few exceptions. You know, Webster, Clay, and Calhoun are very well known and very famous people, but Stephen Douglas, I mean, how many people know anything about Douglas except that he had debates with Lincoln? Which is kind of amazing. Douglas was a big name in the 1850s. He was the most important Democrat, more important than the presidents in that period, although how many people talk about Franklin Pierce anymore, or James Buchanan? But I think the problem with Hamlin is that, again, he was a politician and was vice president. He was minister to Spain for a brief time in 1881 and 2, due to the influence of his friend James G. Blaine, who was Secretary of State. And when he went over to Spain, he was at a party one day, and the various dignitaries there were quite impressed with the fact that he'd been vice president of the United States, which Hamlin knew indicated they didn't know anything about this office. Otherwise, we would have known what a weak office it was, and what a frustrating office it was. For an active man like Hamlin in the Civil War, wanting to do more, there was a very great limit on what he could really do. And Lincoln, as I said, sort of ignored him. Lincoln had so many other things to worry about, including the whole emancipation thing, that catering to the injured feelings of his vice president was not high in his list of priorities.
Okay, so do you think he was an abolitionist?
Yes, he was an abolitionist, certainly when the war came. Not before. Not before. When the war came, right after the Battle of Bull Run, he and some Republican senators went to the White House and urged Lincoln to free the slaves then. But Lincoln couldn't do this because, as Lincoln said, I hope we have God on our side, but we must have Kentucky. Kentucky and Maryland and Delaware and Missouri were Union slave states. And any attempt prematurely to get rid of slavery there would mean that he might lose those states. So he had to wait. And he had to wait particularly until a Union victory came along. And the victory at Antietam in 1862 in September was the one he chose. And he issued a preliminary emancipation proclamation. Said that emancipation is done as a war measure. And if the Confederates didn't stop fighting by January 1st, 1863, he would issue the final proclamation freeing all of the slaves in areas under Confederate control, but freeing none of them in areas under Union control.
Do you understand all that?
Yeah, which means that it really was a war measure. And as time went by, as the Union armies began to take over these territories, the slaves were actually freed there. But Lincoln was concerned about what would happen after the war. Maybe there would be an attempt to revoke that Emancipation Proclamation. Maybe there would be an attempt to re-enslave these people. So what was needed was a constitutional amendment freeing the slaves everywhere, and that's the 13th Amendment. And so, in a way, Lincoln's greatest contribution, with Hamlin's help and enthusiastic support, as a matter of fact, too, his greatest contribution to getting rid of slavery was his support for the 13th Amendment, which was passed in 1865. And on the amendment, the original document of the amendment, along with Lincoln's signature, there is the signature of Hannibal Hamlin as President of the Senate. So this happened just before he left office.
So, what do you know about Cyrus Hamlin, and was he an abolitionist?
I assume that Cyrus Hamlin was, yes, I think, and Charles Hamlin was too, the older brother. He was the younger brother of Hannibal Hamlin. There were three children by his first wife, Sarah Jane Emory, who died, I think, of cancer in the 1850s. Whereupon Hannibal Hamlin married her younger half-sister, Ellen Hamlin, and had two children by her. So he had two very young children when he was a middle-aged man, actually. Have you ever been to Ellsworth?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
There's a famous law firm in Ellsworth that they, I think it's still, they're probably different, obviously different lawyers. It's called Hale and Hamlin. And the Hale was Eugene Hale, who was a senator from Maine, and the Hamlin was Hannibal Emory Hamlin, the younger son of Hannibal Hamlin.
I think we
Who
read
wrote the letter?
that he wrote the law books about the kind of law that Brendan studies, the bankruptcy law.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Because we read that somewhere.
Yeah. And actually, I think Charles Hamlin was involved in bankruptcy law too.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, so yeah. But anyway, Charles and Cyrus were the older sons, and they had a daughter. There was a daughter too, Sarah Jane Hamlin, and both these young men went into the Union Army, and both emerged as generals.
I always got his sister and his wife. I mean, his daughter and his wife mixed up.
Same name, but I think they were exactly the same name. And Sarah Jane Hamlin and her husband were in Ford's Theater the night Lincoln was shot, which is kind of dramatic. She wrote a letter to her. In fact, the first article I ever published was in the Columbia Library columns publication on that letter and about Hannibal Hamlin. So, but yeah, these two young men did very well in the war, and Cyrus Hamlin was willing to command black troops. Not everybody was willing to do that. There was a lot of race prejudice and other things.
Wasn't there that quote about how Union soldiers would rather go hide in the bushes or something?
I don't know if I
There was
read
some
that
quote
one.
about how the Union soldiers would rather go hide somewhere until the war was over than fight with African American troops.
Oh, is that right? No, that's not from my book. I don't remember that quote, but it could be. But these African American troops were very brave. A number of them were killed at the attack on Fort Wagner outside of Charleston, when Robert Gould Shaw, does that name ring a bell with you?
Yeah.
Robert Gould Shaw was a young Boston aristocrat who was a colonel commanding a black regiment, and he was killed, and most of his men were killed trying to attack this fort outside of Charleston.
Wasn't that the battle with the 54th Massachusetts?
I think it might have been, yeah. And if you go down to Boston, you go up on Beacon Hill, you'll see a big plaque, a big sculptured plaque showing Robert Gould Shaw with his black troops. So these men fought very hard, and they fought for the freedom of their fellow blacks. Is what they were fighting for. They understood this, and they were eager to do it, really. And they were as good soldiers as any white soldiers on either side.
Okay, so you kind of answered my next question about the Time magazine. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, some things are slightly true. I mean, he as Minister to Spain, he was sort of a tourist, and he was, this was a plum given to him as a reward for faithful service to the Republican Party. But the idea that he was a do-nothing slacker is ridiculous. He had a very active political career, worked very hard at his job, and had some influence on things like anti-slavery and emancipation and black troops.
It's kind of like he made that one whiny quote about, I am the most unimportant man in Washington.
Slow and unsatisfactory movements of the government. Nobody pays any attention to me, basically, which was true. It was exactly true. And yet he wanted to be renominated for vice president again, no question about that. He was stunned when he was defeated. And in 1868, there was talk about nominating him to run with General Grant. And he said, I tried to do my whole duty and was then unceremoniously whistled down the wind. I don't want that I do not want that to happen again. He was wounded and injured by the fact he was repudiated by the convention. And he would have been so much better a president than Andrew Johnson. It's kind of sad that he wasn't elected for second term. Because Johnson was a disaster as president. After all, he was impeached, although not convicted.
Yeah. And then Maine would have gotten a vice president and a president.
That's right. Well, Maine would have gotten if he'd been renominated, they would have had both. Double header.
So it seems to me that Hannibal Hamlin should be better known as a champion of African American rights, considering his role in the integration of the Army and Emancipation Proclamation and other abolitionist politics. But when he is known, he's mainly known as vice president or even ineffectual vice president.
the job itself leads to ineffectuality. I mean, you can't be an effectual vice president unless the president gives you some authority. I mean, one of the best modern examples of that is Lyndon Johnson under John Kennedy. Johnson had been majority leader of the Senate with tremendous power, and suddenly he's vice president with no power at all, and with most of Kennedy's close associates laughing at him as Colonel Cornpone and his little pork chop, as they called Mrs. Johnson. And he was terribly frustrated. And then, of course, November 22nd, 1963 comes along and everything changes. And there was an assassination attempt on Lincoln. And, somebody shot at him from the bushes as he rode his horse on the way to the soldiers' home outside of Washington. Didn't hit him, but if he'd been killed, or if he died of, came down with a mild strain of smallpox right after Gettysburg, after the Gettysburg Address, if he died of either of those things, Hamlin would have been in power. And it would have been a very different story. But that's the only way you get to power in those days as vice president, is unless the president somehow decides he wants to give you something really important to do.
Yeah,
But,
if I were president in those days, I would just, for instance, the vice president just having something to do with the assassination, with an assassination attempt or something, I would just give the vice president some power so he didn't have reason to assassinate me.
well, that's an interesting way to look at it. And yes, that's. But another thing you should be aware of is that Lincoln did not choose Hamlin to be vice president. He was chosen by the convention to his horror. He was horrified when he found out he'd been nominated, because he said if he'd been at the convention, he would have turned it down. He didn't want to be vice president. But the people in Maine, the Republicans in Maine, thought that was a great thing to have a vice president from Maine. So that was the situation. He found he was stuck with the job, and there wasn't too much he could do about it.
Okay, so I have some sources that include 12 Americans.
Oh yes, by Carroll. Yes,
Carroll.
Yep. That's
The
a good
Sable
source.
Arm by
Yep.
Dudley
Dudley
Taylor
Cornish. Yep. Good.
So Hannibal.
In my book and Charles Hamlin's book.
So Hannibal, The Life of Abraham Lincoln's First Vice President by Mark Scroggins.
Yeah, that book.
Do you know that one?
I do not. I know of it.
Okay.
I've never seen it before.
We have a copy, but we had to
Oh,
go
you
to
had
the
a copy?
we
Oh,
had
okay.
to go to the Maine State Library to get it.
Yeah, it's
Although
Out of print, right?
it is online, we found. So when
Yeah,
you Google parts of it, you could read it online. And
Oh,
what
I
it
see,
seems maybe like an easier version of yours. It's a lower
Well, I was talking.
reading level.
I was talking to a man who is head of an organization that he does. He dresses up like Hannibal Hamlin.
Oh.
Instead of a Hannibal Hamlin organization in Bangor. And I asked him about this book, and he said there's nothing new in it.
That's
compared
what
to mine. Yeah.
I wondered.
I
But it
don't-
might be.
Does he make any reference to my book?
Oh
anymore?
yeah,
He
you're
does?
all through it. And in fact, I even think like the way he organized it is very similar to yours.
Yeah.
Even.
And this book is a University Press of America is a vanity press. You pay to have them publish a book.
Thank
so,
you.
Yeah.
There we go. So that would not be considered as scholarly a source as yours by those
Probably
little
not.
things
Although
there.
if you find something in there useful, you can use it. Sure.
Okay.
Whichever.
I'd love to know more about the 12 Americans one because that doesn't have any endnotes.
No, that's right.
And we
True
tried
enough.
to figure out, so we looked up the author, and I found like some report that someone had written on him, and it said that he worked for newspapers, so he was a newspaper reporter,
Journalist. Yep.
and he was, but he also wrote plays, and his dramatic telling just seems a wee bit over the top to be able to use as a scholarly source.
It could be, but I used it in my book, particularly the incident where Hamlin was pulled off the train by accident. Remember
Right.
that? He was,
Right.
they
Before the crash.
They were so eager to embrace him that they grabbed him and the train began to move. They dragged him right off the train. He had to run down the track to get to the train. And Hamlin was passed through Baltimore at about the same time, or a little bit after Lincoln had snuck through Baltimore secretly, and Hamlin's train was boarded by some of these ruffians, but they didn't recognize him. And
Right.
that's one of the beauties of being vice president. You're not
You're-
generally recognized, so they didn't know who he was. Otherwise, they would have dragged him out, probably.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would say, by all means, use the Carol thing.
Okay.
It's got it's got stuff you can't find anywhere else. That's one of the things. Just
Right.
like Charles Hamlin's biography.
Right.
Charles Eugene Hamlin's.
Which
Okay.
I have. That was my last one. Life and Times of Hannibal
Yeah.
Lemon.
That is a book that is frequently cited by historians. Sometimes they don't cite my book, but they cite that book, which is a little bit irritating. But hey, what the heck? That's their choice. But
We found you cited all over the place.
did you really? Yeah.
We really did.
Well,
Yeah.
that's good.
So in all sorts of the Google searches and
Yeah.
all sorts of different stuff
Yeah, I
came
don't
up
do
all
it.
the time.
Believe me, I don't do anything with the internet at all. I'm very old-fashioned that way. But,
It's wonderful for finding quotes.
Oh, yes,
because,
I'm sure.
So like for instance, if we found a
I
little
took
bit,
a
like the
part
quote
of-
from like the a voice from the east or a star from
Oh,
the east is now.
Oh yes, yes.
like-
John
like at
Quincy
the-
Adams.
So you just put that little quote right
John
in, and
yeah.
it will take you to as
Isn't that something? That's
So that's
amazing.
pretty
books.
amazing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
when you're doing your reading, if you've got like, oh, I'd like to put that in here, you just got to remember 3 or 4 words, and
Yeah,
you'll be able to find
that's-
it quickly and
that's
easily.
Really great. Yeah, that's
Yeah, so that's
tremendous
wonderful
help, yeah.
for that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And your book came up a bunch of times.
Yeah,
just
I
when
know
you do
that. I know that I'm on Google.
Yeah. Well, and we noticed too that your book is available because we could buy your book and we could get it through interlibrary loan very easily.
It's out of print now, but it
but
it is
it's
available.
out there.
Yeah, it's
you
out
know,
there. Yeah.
it's out there.
Yeah.
Whereas
we
the
bought-
Scroggins book, no.
Yeah.
And even though that was written in like 1990
Yeah.
something,
I think
we
they.
really couldn't get a copy of it.
I think
It's
they
not
pub.
good.
I think they published probably very few copies of that University Press of
Okay.
America book. They published, I think, about 1,500 of my.
Yeah.
They're all first editions.
Yeah.
But they are available. Although quite expensive now, I think.
We can-
This was a $9 book when it first came out.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, they're a little more than 9.
Yeah.
We've got one coming from Amazon, but it didn't
Yeah.
get here in
Oh,
time
you
to
do?
get
Oh,
you to
good.
sign
That's
it.
good. Yeah. Well, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Thought a week and a half would be enough.
Oh, is that what the weekend?
Yeah, we could. Well, as we found, we got the interview because I love books.
Yeah.
So I was like,
Well,
ooh,
I have a
we
lot of
can,
them.
you know, yeah, get signed.
I have a whole Lincoln collection. I've been
I bet you do.
collecting Lincolniana
Yeah,
since I was a kid, actually. Since
Yeah.
I was younger than you are.
yeah.
So, on page, which one was it? All Americans.
Be careful because that's the old one.
There's
That's
your
a library book, huh? Oh, there's an old book there too? Yeah.
We've got the
This-
12 Americans.
Oh,
who's
you have
supposed
it-
to
you have
quote
it-
you.
oh, you
We
have it.
do.
There
yeah.
it is.
We got that
Oh,
one.
there it is. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
12 Americans.
Wait, is that a library book too? Or is
It's Maine State Library book
Oh, look
that
at
we got
that,
through
yeah.
interlibrary loan. But that also is available online because we found it in Google Books. So they
Oh.
have somebody went through and scanned it all in.
Isn't that something?
So
That's
that
great.
was pretty cool.
Looks
But
like
what
it's falling
we got
apart,
it
yeah.
because I wanted to see if it had endnotes.
Yeah.
And because
No,
I
it
wouldn't
doesn't.
sure, and it doesn't.
No.
But it does have the preface, which I
Mhm.
thought was interesting. And the preface talked about how each of the sketches that are in here were put in smaller form in, was it New York Times, Aaron?
Which one?
He said that all of the stories, so these are expounded upon original articles that came from the New York Times, I believe.
Oh, okay.
So I thought that led some credibility to it.
Yeah. Maybe he was a journalist for the New York Times.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he was, I think. So, and it said he did some interviewing, although it does, no notes or no, and it was very, very hard for me to find any information about the Carroll author.
Yeah. Did you come across Alexander K. McClure by any chance?
I don't think so.
Alexander K. McClure wrote a book called Lincoln and Men of War Times.
I
He
don't.
has a chapter on, I think it's a chapter on Hannibal Hamlin.
Okay.
And McClure was one of those people who claimed that Lincoln had asked him to support Andrew Johnson at the convention rather than Hamlin.
Oh.
Big controversy broke out when Hannibal Hamlin died. Hannibal Hamlin died on the 4th of July, 1891,
Yeah.
while playing cards at the Tarentine Club in Portland,
Mhm.
in Bangor. And the religious people around the state and around the country thought it was terrible that he died playing cards, as they thought it was terrible that Lincoln was shot in a theater on Good Friday.
Oh, interesting.
He was shot in a theater on Good Friday. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, McClure came out and indicated that Lincoln had asked him to support Johnson, and John G. Nicolay, who was Lincoln's private secretary, he and John Hay wrote a massive.
Right, I've heard about him.
history.
The Hay guy I'd heard about.
Nicolay. John Hay was later Secretary of State under McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay.
Anyway, a big controversy arose, and the McClure book has an appendix with all kinds of letters and all kinds of reminiscences about the question of who did Lincoln choose in 1864, or did he choose anybody?
Right.
So you might want to pick up that McClure, M-C-C-L-U-R-E,
Okay.
Alexander K. McClure, Lincoln and Men of War Times.
All right.
That
we'll
has some
look
interesting
that up.
stuff in there. But that's the big historical issue. The big historical issue is what did Lincoln in fact choose Andrew Johnson? I think he probably did, but he did it behind the scenes and secretly. And people like John G. Nicolay thought he was indeed Honest Abe and would never do that. Hey, Lincoln was a great politician, and he would do what he had to do to get reelected, because he believed that unless he was reelected, the war would not be won. Simple as that. Even if General McClellan had been elected, it would not have ended. The war would not have ended as it should have ended with the surrender of the South. So this was a big deal for Lincoln, and choosing Andrew Johnson secretly would not have been above what he would have done. To bring that about. So what else you got there?
So on page 159 to 160 here, in 12 Americans, so I'm quoting here, 10 Army officers, all brave, well-informed, and earnest men, though none of them particularly high rank, went to the Vice President's lodgings and begged him to urge the President to authorize the arming of Negroes.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if one of these 10 was Cyrus Hamlin.
Yes, I think he was. I'm pretty sure he was. In fact,
That's what I thought.
in my book, I think I indeed indicate. Let me see if I can find that. I was looking at this book yesterday.
We kind of like Cyrus a lot. He seems a very romantic figure to me. I think he sounds wonderful, going off and saying, "I'll do it." He just seems very romantic to me. Romantic isn't like boyfriend girlfriend romantic. It's romantic as in like he was trying to fight for causes and dashing and that kind of romantic.
That's right. Yeah. Let's see. One evening in January, 10 officers in uniform, led by Vice President's son Cyrus, trooped into Hamlin's hotel room. Major Hamlin, formerly of Fremont's staff, but now looking for a challenging assignment, explained their mission. And that's when Hamlin sent a messenger to the White House to request an appointment with Lincoln for 9 o'clock the next morning. So at 9 o'clock, Hamlin and Cyrus and the other officers went to the White House. And according to, I think Carroll is the source for that. And
that's what I thought too.
Sounds like he probably would be. But Cyrus was definitely there. And of course, he's a major in 1863 and a brevet major general in 1865. So he rose rapidly through the ranks.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay.
I think you can use that.
And do you know when this was, like the date?
It would have been. I got it again. It would have been after the emancipation, after the final proclamation.
Okay.
A second. I just had it a minute ago. Look at the index again.
Yeah.
I had to do this.
We love indexes.
I had to do, well, you probably wouldn't have loved this one, Stephanie, because I had to do this one myself, and I thought it was going to drive me crazy.
Oh my goodness.
A friend of mine helped me by listing all the names that I had to look up.
Yeah.
And I did it by myself.
Oh my
I should have
goodness.
had the publisher do it, but because it's a terrible job.
No, we really like books with indexes because it really helps us out.
Yep.
And it's very,
I
and
can
for
just
relooking
imagine
stuff
what a
up
pain that
especially.
would have been.
Oh, look at
Oh
all.
yeah, it really was. Let's see, one evening in January, that would have been January 1863,
Okay.
Good.
because the Emancipation Proclamation, in effect, provided for the use of black troops if the president so desired.
Yeah.
And this little bit of pressure, I think, was a factor in his going along that way.
Do you have a pencil? I don't have a pencil.
I'll get you one.
I think I've got something in here.
I've got a
Usually
whole-
I carry something.
If not, I've
Here we
got.
go. I got
Okay.
my little pencil case.
Did that come with the laptop?
It did, isn't that cute? Here, I'll give you a blue one. So. They're girly pencils.
I would say you've done a lot of work on this project, and I commend you for the amount of work you've done. That's terrific. Now, are you?
Careful of those pages, sweetie. Those are the old. That's the old ones. They're falling right out.
Now you said in your letter that you're homeschooled, right? Are you going to be going to a public high school at any point, or are you going to
We're in
continue?
negotiations presently because he's 8th grade next year.
So
And-
possibly.
So my husband and I have been talking about it. My
Yeah.
husband teaches at Yarmouth.
Oh, he does.
So
Okay. Yeah.
Aaron could go to Yarmouth, and we live in Bowdoin, so we could go to Mount Ararat Middle School.
Oh,
and
yeah.
both are lovely, and he has
Yeah.
friends at Mount Ararat
Good.
Middle School.
That's good.
I had friends
At
Yarmouth,
Yarmouth because he
but-
went to
out of contact. First grade.
art classes in first grade in
Oh,
Yarmouth,
at Yarmouth, yeah.
and has marched in the parades because his dad is a music teacher. So
Oh, I see. Okay.
So
yeah.
he's got some connections in
That might
both.
be
It's
good, yeah.
just
Yeah.
trying to figure it out because he's starting to get a little beyond what we're going to be able to do.
Sure.
My dad teaches math to them, which has been a
Oh, that right.
blessing
Yeah. Yeah.
because that's not my strength. So he
Yeah.
took that over, and that's been wonderful.
Yeah.
And they've been challenged in math.
Math
they're-
was always
they're
my
doing
worst
great.
subject. I always
Right.
had terrible trouble with
He
math.
taught it to her before and after school because her school wasn't having her memorize the things.
That's right. I'm sure you've heard that a
Make
few
her
times.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Aaron enjoys math, and I do not enjoy math. So
Mhm.
obviously, it's nice to have someone who enjoys math teaching you math when you enjoy math.
I never.
Also, he rewards us with food.
I never enjoyed math, nor did I understand geometry at all. Geometry defeated me totally.
Yes, it's hard.
I could do the addition, multiplication, division, and
Yeah.
what's the other one?
Subtraction. That's
Subtraction.
what
Thank
we-
you, Stephanie, yeah. I can do those, and I can look up the tables in trigonometry. But as far as geometry, I don't have the kind of a mind that can deal with that. Apparently. So.
I
Well,
just
seems-
tend to make stupid mistakes.
Which the famous math quote is, "Those are the hardest ones to fix."
Yeah.
Are the careless errors.
Yeah. That's right.
Okay, so I think you answered this one, right? As a historian, do you have any idea as to where I could find any pictures of Hannibal Hamlin's son Cyrus and his
Yeah,
African American
well,
troops? That's what this is, right?
Ezra Warner, Generals in Blue is where that comes from.
Okay.
It's a book published by Louisiana State University Press. There's also one on Generals in Gray. They're very useful books because they have a biography of every general officer
Oh,
on either
neat.
side. On either side, yeah. And so that's where you can get. Well, you've got the
Yep.
thing there in the citation.
Yeah, that's great.
You can use that as in your bibliography.
Okay, and then the last question is, if you wanted the world to know one thing about Hannibal Hamlin, what would it be?
The fact that he's been so completely forgotten, in a sense, and unfortunately so, because again, this is a man who had a very long career and had achievements in his career that are significant, and yet his career is a commentary on the Civil War vice presidency and the 19th century vice presidency. One later important politician they were talking about for vice president said, "I want to be dead before I'm actually buried." So he didn't want to run for vice president. Another one said John Nance Garner of Texas, who was vice president of Franklin Roosevelt for 8 years, said the vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher full of warm spit. And he didn't say, and it was actually warm piss, he said, but they cleaned it up a little bit. So that's kind of the attitude of
That's right.
many vice presidents. Unless the president dies, then everything changes, as with Harry Truman.
yay, I'm in charge.
Yeah. Okay. So we made it just under because it's 59:49, Aaron. So perfectly done.
So it's an
So
hour.
it's an hour
An hour
long.
long.
Yep.